developmental disabilities. How do we do that? So our goals for tonight are broken up into 4 categories. We're going to talk a little bit about chasing the why, thinking about why children might be distressed, thinking about how we can apply the notion of accommodations in the home setting to manage distress, some techniques for managing anxiety, and ways that we can help foster the development of coping skills and habits. I'd like to start by saying that certainly if you are on this presentation today, you know someone with a developmental disability, you're a parent of a child with a disability, you're otherwise involved. And so it may not be a surprise to you that 1 in 6 children aged 3 to 17 is diagnosed with 1 or more developmental disorders. That's quite a big chunk, and it's roughly 15% of the population. So it's no small potatoes, no small deal of what we're trying to get to tonight. And we know that children with disability have increased risk for behavior issues, behavior problems. We know that even typical child problems occur more frequently, more severely, and for a longer length of time than their other peer counterparts. Certainly one of the most frequent referrals that we get within our clinic, we have lots of concerns with things like tantrums, kids being really rigid, aggression, and the challenges that those look like. Children who are having difficulty with a parent saying no, a parent providing a limit setting. Children don't want to hear that. They're not fans of that. We see kids who have difficulty with changes, whether it be minor, just a transition of the routine, or a change within the environment, not being a favorite color, not getting to have a favorite food, not going to Target. We see challenges with problem solving, and we see problems with emotional regulation. So it kind of makes us wonder, what makes a child with a developmental disorder more susceptible to problems with change? Well, each developmental disorder, like each child, often has specific areas of challenge that add to distress for parents and children. We know that there are strengths and weaknesses in areas like communication, cognition, sensory, motor skills, and social relating that are impacting their distress level and their ability to function within the world in a way that is good for them and good for their parents. Let's talk a little bit about communication. So the first idea is that sometimes children don't have the vocabulary that they need to express their needs very well. Some children may be nonverbal, and even our nonverbal children may or may not have the words through a PECS program or through a talker to help them get their needs met. The flip side of that will be kids who are more of a wordsmith. So kids who have this great vocabulary, but they're either very literal or very attached to it, right? You said we would be done in a minute, and a minute has passed, right? So sometimes communication, it can be a paucity, you can see this poverty, it could go either way. We see children who have, like I said, difficulties with pragmatics. They don't have good words or ways to ask for help, make a request, or say no. Our literal language users, children who have difficulty with comprehension, children who have difficulty with bandwidth, meaning being able to take only so much language at a time before their brain is full, right? And so bandwidth is very real, and certainly those of you who have children doing distance learning right now can relate that our kiddos get to that point in the day where they are done, and you may yourself also be done at points. We know children have difficulty expressing themselves in real time. They can do it, but they need an extra beat to pull their words together, to organize and get it out. And we always have to remember that sometimes high verbal skills can mask difficulties. So we know, again, children who have these great vocabularies, they seem very articulate, they talk a good game, but they're actually hiding a lot of other challenges beneath those verbal skills. When we talk about cognition, we're talking about intellect, we're talking about problem solving. Attention is certainly within that realm. We have this idea of how we learn and file that new information away. So part of that cognition is being able to learn a new skill and then recall it the next day. So that's not unusual for us to come across parents and children where they've learned a task, they seem to know it, and for whatever reason, they seem to find it a new challenge the next day. They don't have that retention of it. We see children for whom abstract thinking and abstract tasks are challenging. So kids who are great with rote information, kids who are great with facts, and yet in the face of an activity in which they have to be a more abstract thinker, really can fall apart a bit because it's just not in their, it's not their strength. We see children who have difficulty with the big picture. We also sometimes see kids who have difficulty being able to pick out meaningful parts. So they're looking at everything, but would have difficulty telling you like the Reader's Digest version of something. Cognition can affect your time and space organization. That becomes more important as we become older. And certainly as we get up through middle school, you need to have a lot more of that. And definitely as society and through school, it seems that as children are in middle school, there's more of an expectation that they are becoming better, independent organizers of their time and information. Flexibility, kids having difficulty learning from trial and error approaches. Children have difficulty with problem solving. So we see kids that they try it one way and they are not successful, and yet the very next time the problem comes up, the exact same thing happens again. And so it's not a good problem solving approach. Children who might have difficulty generalizing the information they have. So they've learned really well how to do something, maybe with a teacher or with a parent, but they may not necessarily be applying that in other ways that would be helpful for them. And then we can also see children who are really reliant on cues to help them know and get the information that they need. So all this is to say is that, you know, sometimes we also have to remember that there can be a mismatch between chronological and cognitive age for children. So that's a very real problem for kids who have significant cognitive and intellectual deficits, that you may have a child who is 13 or 14, but their cognitive function, their problem solving, their attention, and their learning style is more akin to 3 or 4. We expect different things from tall kids, from big kids, and when there's this mismatch, it certainly adds to the challenges that we may have. When we're talking about sensory issues that may be unique to children with developmental disorders, we're thinking of kids who may be defensive or distracted by sensory input. It could be clothing, sometimes lights that make noise. Distraction and problems can really impair attention. You know, we see children have difficulty with self-regulation, that idea of keeping your body engine at the just right level. Some of you may be familiar with the ALERT program. It's a great sensory strategy through occupational therapy. And in that ALERT program, there's this great idea of this analogy that your body is like a car engine and we need to have it at the just right level. And sometimes it runs really high and sometimes it's low, but we want to ultimately have it at this just right level. Difficulty choosing a just right strategy is another very real challenge. So a great example could be, my son has a lot of difficulty choosing a just right strategy, although his strategy of clapping his hands and jumping up and down 42 times might be really effective for him, it may, one, drive the rest of the household bananas, and it may not be as effective as doing something else, like chewing a piece of gum or having some TheraBand on his chair or having another type of movement break. So sensory runs from small to big, and it can impact us in lots of different ways. When we think of motor challenges, we think of both primary and secondary things. Primary motor issues are those of limitation, those of movement. So we see fine motor issues with things like writing, maybe self-care, being able to point to choose something. That's particularly important if you're a nonverbal child, being able to make some choices. We see challenges with gross motor issues, like for movement and motor control, coordination, and also for relaxation. We don't often think about that, but being able to relax, your muscles relax your body is really important to your overall health. We also see a lot of secondary challenges as well, and those are usually ones of access, and those that impact our ability to get information the same way. So a child who's having writing difficulties, one, can have increased distress when there are writing demands. And then we end up spending more time trying to talk a child into writing than them actually doing it. Or they may not do whatever it is. So children who are having coordination issues, fine motor issues, they may not be able to access or play the same types of games that their peers are on the playground. Exercise is another really big component too. So there's a lot of exercise that requires good ambulation, and we often think of things like running, or we think of things like walking, but those certainly aren't the only exercises that are involved. And so motor skills can definitely impact our overall well-being. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about social relating. So we know that having difficulty with perspective taking, that sort of understanding that someone else can have an idea that is different than your idea. It may or may not be a dumb idea, but being able to appreciate that not everyone thinks the same way is a good step in the right direction. Children may have difficulty understanding the social rules, the social nuances of how the world works. There's a lot of what Michelle Garcia Winner refers to as hidden social rules. So a rule might be that if you're in the front of the class and you're giving a presentation, it would be unexpected for you to have, gumballs or something in your front pocket and be totally fidgeting around there. That might give people a wacky thought, right? So it's not against the law, and there's not a rule that says don't have gumballs in your front pocket and be fidgeting in front of the classroom while you're giving a presentation, but people will kind of know that, well, that's kind of a hidden social rule. It's kind of expected. Social relating challenges can also involve ways in which we think of how children can negotiate differences. And some of those things can be affected by their ability to read body language, voice tone, and emotion. So here we've sort of talked about there's lots of different ways that a developmental disorder might specifically affect a child's problem solving and their success in the world, right? Their comfort in the world that are unique. But we also know that these children often have difficulties because they're children and they just haven't been on the planet very long, right? So young brains have young ways of learning and addressing the world. And so it's always important for us to remember that these challenges are unique. And as I said before, some of these challenges are really, they might be typical of their peers, and yet the way they manifest looks different, and the way in which we support them is really important as well. So let's talk about this concept of chasing the why. Tina Payne Bryson is an excellent author and speaker. She has numerous books, and she talks about this concept of chasing the why. So wondering, why did my child do that? What is my child trying to communicate? So instead of getting angry that there is, instead of being angry that now I go into the living room and, my kiddo is covered with peanut butter sitting on the sofa, I'm thinking, holy smokes, why would that happen? I might think, why did that happen? What were they trying to communicate? Is it sensory curiosity? Is this a kid who's hungry? The inclination might be to get angry. We know that generally most kids are not setting out to just drive us bananas. It's a byproduct of being a child on the planet and having the skills that they have. So we want to think about chasing the why. So we're thinking of, is there a challenge to the expectation? Is that what led to the difficulty? Is there a challenge to the skill? Does my child need to learn something in order to improve this situation, to handle it better? Is the problem due to a regulation issue, right? My son is so wound up that there is no way we're going to be able to get him to XYZ, complete a chore right now. Or is it a difficulty with connection, right? A child who might be acting out as a way of trying to get some attention and connect with us, right? So a great example, let's start with a low-level example in chasing the why. So a low-level distress example is playing and losing a game. And there's definitely going to be a difference in expectation, right? So here we see we've got these 3 kids and they're playing a game and all 3 of them are thinking, I'm going to win, right? And it can often occur that not all 3 of those kids are thinking, oh, everybody's thinking about winning. They're thinking that only they are thinking about winning. And they get really kind of stuck on that idea. And of course, we know that in most cases, if you play a game where someone wins, not everybody wins. And then you have this guy, right? Not happy. So here we have a kid who's really thinking about winning, really wanted to win, didn't want to win, and now is mad, and they're inflexible. And inflexible kids are also unfun kids to be around and to play with. And so this is a real challenge that we have all the time. So, playing games is kind of a low-level issue, but this idea that a kid has something stuck in their brain and they don't know how to move on to something different is, I think, something that a lot of us can relate to. And certainly the most common issue that I treat in children is this idea of rigidity. And a child could be anxious. They might have difficulty making decisions. They might just be really grouchy. So we have this inflexibility, and that inflexibility is a cognitive challenge, but it is also a challenge of skill. So here's an example of something that we might think about to teach this idea of having what we call a flexible brain, having a new thought. Social stories, this concept was really developed by Carol Gray. Here's an example of a social story that I wrote about having a flexible brain. So I know many of you can read this. I'm going to read it anyway. So sometimes I cannot have the choices I want. I can use a flexible brain to help me think of new choices. Flexible brain is a fancy way of saying have a new thought. I might think, oh well, and think of something new to do instead. Sometimes it is hard to have a flexible brain. I might feel upset when things do not go my way. It's good to use a flexible brain when I'm upset. Using a flexible brain helps me be a good problem solver. It might help me feel better to use a flexible brain to think of a new idea. Sometimes when I have a flexible brain, my friends will work to have a flexible brain with me too. And people enjoy being friends with people who have flexible brains. So here we have this social story, and admittedly, this is a story for a kid who has a pretty good vocabulary and pretty good language level. And I think in the absence of doing something that's more drawn out like this, even this part where we see we've got this smiley face and the person is thinking about, oh, I want to go swimming, right? And we've crossed that out. That's not going to be a choice right now. Helping them to think of bike or bubbles. I've used this technique before where I may or may not have the story, but in the moment I might draw like, oh my goodness, you were so wanting to do this. Like you were really thinking about going outside and bike riding right now. And we just can't do that, buddy. Like it's super smoky outside, or the tire has a flat, or whatever. So we need to have a new thought. I might cross that out. And now I'll tell you, that's not always go over really well, but the idea is there. So we're going to think about some different ideas. And I think a lot of kids are better at thinking about this than we may give them credit for. This is a type of strategy that always is better to use and practice ahead of time, the first few times, to see that kids can really do it. Certainly that idea of having a comic strip conversation where you're drawing and thinking so you can show what people might think or what they might say or do. practice it first elsewhere before you do it in the moment. So flexible brains, we say that is a skill, and that's kind of a low-level thing. So what are some ways that we might practice that? So we know we have to create expectations that we practice, right? We can't magically wish that a child gets better at doing something. And it's really easy to default to that, even when we say it, we just wish it was better. We know that that's not going to change. And I think right now, more than ever, I can certainly relate that it can be overwhelming to be a parent right now. And there's so much to do. And so thinking of adding something new to the pile of, do we just throw our hands up, or do we actively try to change something? And so if it's something that is really driving you bananas, I really encourage you to focus on one thing and try to see how you can improve it. So create an expectation, create an opportunity. You might use some visual supports, right? Those are the ways that it changes. So skills get better with practice, period. That's something that we know about pretty much any skill that you can think of. So here's an example of maybe using a visual. This is a visual chart for this idea of having a flexible brain, where we might sort of mark in there when a child has had a flexible brain. And some of them might be really easy, low level, like letting someone go first, right? Or following a direction. This would be the type of thing where we're gonna say, we're gonna practice having flexible brains this week, and here's lots of ways to do it. And you might actively schedule that time and practice when to do it. So it might be during a time when you're playing together and say, oh yeah, hey, this is a good opportunity for us to practice having a flexible brain. So I wonder if you think you want to let me go first this time, or maybe we could do my idea. And then you're going to do these easy things where you've really primed it. So that's, they're thinking about it, and you can get that mark on your chart. So a visual schedule is a great idea. But more importantly, I find that having visuals keeps adults really honest and really on top of the thing that we agreed to do. So how might you use something like that? Well, you could certainly create and find an opportunity at home. So maybe thinking about 15 minutes of shared play with your child. Shared play means doing something together and optimally enjoying it together. So that's kind of key. It's better if you're both enjoying it. May not always be possible. For those of you who have been playing way too much Minecraft with your kids, or dino trucks or trains, you might have to phone it in a little bit, but I'm really going to encourage you to try to stretch yourself and really try to enjoy it in the moment. There's lots of skills that we know we can work on while playing games, and I would definitely be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for why we should play games with kids. So it's not just about that bond, and it's not just about the particular toy. We know that every single time that we play games with children, we're working on turn taking, we're working on shared attention, waiting, good sportsmanship, rules, flexibility, problem solving. So there's so many things we can work on while we're playing a short game with kids. You can play long games too. It's your kids, so you decide what your tolerance is. But there's lots of ways to practice. And I think that even though it sometimes can seem trite and maybe too easy to play a game with a kid and be working on a skill, I think it's a pretty practical way to be working on skills for kids, to work on those sort of core emotional and social regulation skills. So let's talk about what this would look like in practice. We would want to make sure that we're clear with the expectation. So we might make a shared schedule. We're going to say words like, we're going to, right? Kids are not mind readers, literally. So you may or may not have a visual schedule, but you certainly have some kind of plan. So you should share it, right? So we want to think of, how long do they have to do it? When is it going to be? Do they have a choice? Is it going to be before, after dinner? Are there certain toys that they can choose from to do the shared schedule? So make a shared schedule. Use words like we're going to describe what's going to happen. You might use things like a time timer that kind of helps to visually see how much time we have left if you choose an activity or game that is open-ended, then you might need a time timer to do that. Using words like this first and then. So we're going to do your choice first, then we're going to do my choice, and then we're going to have a snack. And I would encourage the use of visual reminders. So you could have a little checklist, you could have little pictures that say things like, we're going to work on having friendly words, or we're frustration words, or having safe bodies. So that's kind of our goal. This is the thing that we're working on, and oh yeah, we're playing this game. So when I say things like, we're going to practice being good sports, what should you expect? Well, one of us will practice winning and the other will practice losing. That is a fact. So depending on what game that you're playing. So might as well get it out of the way ahead of time. So then we can start to think, what are some good sport things to say when we practice being a good sport? We might think of rats or fiddlesticks. Oh, well. It seems sort of silly to kind of write out and think about what are all the ways that you can be frustrated. But I find that we can often be much more attuned to the things that we don't want our kids to say than all of the wonderful choices that we have for being frustrated. I know we're trying to renew a lot of frustration words from the 60s or from old Father Brown episodes around our house. And so you find what works for you, but think, what do you want your child to say instead? And write it down. It might be a good opportunity to say some new, different, or funny things. So here's an example of sort of practicing with a shared schedule to practice this idea of flexibility. I have a son who's now 9. When he was younger, we would make a shared schedule. And so the schedule was this: Liam's choice, my choice, and snack. So Liam, for his choice, chooses Ninjago, which I would never in a million years choose, but that's okay. He chooses it for him. And because it is open-ended, I'm going to use a time timer for it. So I might decide, I'm going to do this for 15 minutes, and then the time timer is going to go off. You could also just as easily say, I'm going to do this for 9 minutes because you are 9 years old, and then it's going to be my choice. Kids tend to go with sometimes wacky rules for things for no certain reason. So Liam's choice would be Ninjago. My choice would be Caribou, and then we'll have a snack. And so I'm going to say, Liam, what do you want to do? He chooses Ninjago. I choose Caribou, and then snack. And then I'm going to repeat it to him over and over again. You might set things out in kind of a delightful or enticing way that are delimited for a child to choose. You might just stack them one ahead of each other, right? So we know, okay, this is done. Now we're doing the next thing on the table. Or you could write or draw it out or have a visual choice board, but the intent is there. So optimally, when we play a game with our kids, we want this fun meter to be at the woohoo, but there's going to be times where it's like, meh. And I think it's okay to check in with kids about that, asking like, wow, we played that game, and what did you think about that? You know, kids will kind of tell you. So for some of our more verbal kids, they may have a lot to say about the choices that you made or didn't do it. You didn't choose something that they like to do, or it was dumb. But it might surprise you too. Sometimes we can get kids to learn some new things. So let's talk about something that's not as low level, something that is more distressing than game. And so that would be schoolwork, right? And so right now we know that most kids are doing remote distance learning. I've got a couple of different kids here. If this is you, I love this picture of this family as sitting so nicely together at their kitchen table, doing all the work together. These look like maybe some more familiar faces, although I have to confess that this one right here looks pretty much like what happens at my house. We've got, you know, this beautiful, nice space set up, and the objects are out. No kids sitting there because he's not into it. So that's what's fun at my house these days. So schoolwork is definitely increasing the drama on distress and causing a lot of distress in kids. So again, we want to think of being clear with expectations. So, and this is hard, right? Schools are just figuring out and we're figuring out. So for all of us, we need to be true to ourselves and clear with ourselves. What is it that we're expecting kids to do, right? Your expectation is, I just want you to sit in your seat during the class meeting, right? Or I want you to be in the place when the class meeting is. I want you to do four activities. So be clear what it is that you're expecting out of your child, and you know your child best. Some of us are at a spot where just showing up is enough. Like, that's a great expectation. And some of us are at a point where we can really be more demanding of our child to say, well, I expect all this work to be done before it's finished. So be clear with your expectations. It doesn't mean that you have to stick with staying at the same place for the entire semester, but whatever your expectation is, say it, show it. Make a shared schedule. Make a schedule that you both can see. I think a lot of schools are really trying to do a good job of having a schedule for kids that they can see that, okay, we're doing a class meeting and then it's small groups. Then maybe it is a break or some other type of applied learning time. And so we want to make sure that on that shared schedule that we see the things that we need to do, that we're clear about the expectation. Is it show up? Is it participate? Is it complete? And we want to make sure that we put things on there that our child wants to do too, even if that means that it's just at the very end, right? So it might be like, yeah, this is the breaks, right? We're doing school in the morning, and then we'll have lunch, and then Mario Kart, or then art class, or then whatever, we'll play Ninjago together for 20 minutes. So our children need to see that there's something, that little light at the end of the tunnel too. We want to have a plan. We want to remember to aim for consistency, not perfection. It doesn't have to be the best plan on the planet. It doesn't have to be the best schedule. And today doesn't have to be the best day ever. We want to just aim for consistency. And some of the things that we know can help manage anxiety are consistency, routine, and ritual, right? I would encourage you to do things at the beginning of your day that children kind of associate with going to school. So whether it just means we all stop and fill up our water bottle before we get started for the day, that I put my books in my backpack, I walk them the 10 feet to where my desk is, that I have a workspace. Some kids are fortunate to have a desk that is ongoing. It's their desk, and others might just have a space. But again, like each day, we want to create a ritual and routine about that. I actually saw a really funny thing on YouTube where a dad decided to have morning announcements each day. And so kudos for him for really taking it to the next level. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of, so how do we accommodate our kids? How do we support them in doing these things that are different? We often think of accommodations as something that happens in the school setting. And some of us are pretty good at thinking about, well, what would that mean if a child was at school? And it can be easy to forget that those things can be really applicable to what we're doing now. And there are some things as parents that we can try doing and trying to be mindful and present for. So for communication, we want to think about the necessity of having short and clear instructions, right? Schedules, outlines of instruction. So this is definitely true in the older grades, that we have a lot of didactic teaching for kids. So younger kids might be on things like Seesaw, in which they're looking at something and they're kind of watching and learning at the same time. Older kids may not be getting that same. So they're really just listening to a lecture similar to what you're doing now, and yet without the benefit of any type of instruction. That's an outline, So I think I've always felt that I wish that school was set up a little bit more like colleges, and that often in a college class, you get an outline of the class before that day's lecture, and it kind of can help you to follow along a little bit. So sometimes a visual or outline of instruction can be helpful. We want to think of communication needs. Should your child be listening instead of reading directly? Is that something that they need? Or should a child be reading instead of listening? So kids have different strengths and weaknesses. So we definitely need to think about how that affects them. And so we may need accommodations from the school, but we can also think for ourselves that we want to remember that we also give our own children short, clear instructions, that I give them a visual, right? That I remember if I'm giving my child an instruction about how to do something, does he need me to tell him how to do it? Should I show him how to do it? Should I make a mystery message about how to do it? So lots of different ways to think about that. Some of the accommodations for cognitive issues involve having a reduced workload. So I kind of mentioned that a little bit when I think of my son, certainly at the first part of the year. So it's so much, right? So we kind of reduce the workload that we are requiring from him until it kind of builds back up. We see other kids where it's this mismatch. It's not a good fit between maybe where their age is and maybe what their peers are doing. So reducing the workload. We want to make sure that work matches their ability. Again, I think a lot of schools are really trying to do their best to make that happen. And they're really relying on us to give them that good information. We know that with cognitive challenges that we need to repeat ideas. So ideas need to be repeated, and the additional time for processing and completion. I think it's important to kind of call out here, though, too, that because of this increased stress that we all have right now, that really impacts cognitive function. It impacts attention, it impacts learning. And so we're going to be getting more to kind of how in general can we be thinking about distress and managing that. Different accommodations for motor, scribing for your child. So let the purpose drive the process. So if the purpose of writing a story is that your child creates a story and they're getting hung up on writing because they don't want to write, or your child can't physically write, keyboard it, do talk to text, scribe it for them, right? So that's an example of an accommodation there. For sensory, we think of flexible seating. So sitting, standing, maybe having a TheraBand on a chair, having regular breaks. Those breaks should be throughout the day, and they should be planned, as well as the opportunity for breaks just needed in the moment. Just when we notice for kids, hey, that doesn't really look like it's working for you right now. You look like you need a break, right? And we can be neutral about that. We're just noticing. It's important for kids to have a toolbox for them. And so it could be things like fidgets. I'm not talking about fidget spinners. That is not a great fidget. Sometimes a fidget could be kind of like I have right now. I've got this little hair tie and I'm kind of playing with it in my hands. But it's not distracting me. It's not talking to me, and I'm not tossing it around. So I feel like kudos to me. I'm doing a good job with that. But fidgets can be these small things that kids have. It could be therapy. It could be a straw. It could be something homemade. Books can also be in a toolbox for sensory needs. Sometimes something like I Spy, looking at something. We're kind of regulating. We have both of our eyes kind of converging at a point to do something. Can be calming for us. We're focusing. Puzzles, mazes, those things might be. I think also some good visuals. I'll show a picture later. It's just kind of watching something can be calming too. Accommodation for social challenges could be the option to have the camera off. So we're finding that while some of our friends, particularly a number of our friends with autism, may feel that they're doing better in school, like they're enjoying the process better because they don't have the same type of social demands on them in the same way, the camera work can actually be overwhelming. Like it can be intense to be on camera all the time. And so sometimes having the camera off might be a reasonable accommodation for that. And again, it could be that they need more asynchronous. These are the terms: asynchronous, less synchronous. So that means more time that they're doing self-directed, self-practice learning versus that time that they're spending with a lot of other people watching them and seeing what's going on. So Janet, I kind of built in this time right now that I thought there's so much to talk about that maybe we could chat a little bit and see, what we're thinking about distress or why kids with developmental disabilities might be distressed right now, accommodations.
Yeah, so there's been some really great conversation happening in the Q&A box, and there's some wonderings. So can you talk to us more about finding how to set the right expectation?
Yeah, yes. So I think when I think of setting the right expectation, I'm trying to think of where does the child ultimately, what are they supposed to be doing? So what they're supposed to be doing is showing up for class, being in the place that they're supposed to be with their materials together, paying attention the whole time, getting all the things done, and optimally doing it independently, right? So when I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of things, right, for a small body. So where are we at with that? So kind of like doing an inventory. So is my kid able to do this independently yet? Is my child able to sustain attention to the task, or stay in the place? Do they have their materials? Thinking of kind of where their bandwidth is, just noticing. So we really have to be kind of detectives in that first part of like, well, how long into it is a kid maybe upset about something or they need a break? And so does that break need to shift a little bit? So I start, when I think of the expectations, sometimes it's just self-check for me, like, well, what is it that's driving me bananas about this situation? And what did I think they were supposed to be doing? And sometimes that's just a good call out to myself, like, oh, okay, like that wasn't really reasonable to think that was going to happen. So maybe I start with the core expectation is school time is, for example, we do school time in the morning. That's my basic expectation for that. And so my basic expectation may not be that it is 3 or 4 hours long, but my basic expectation is we're going to set aside some time for schoolwork and we will do something school-y at the beginning of the day, right? So that's the very basic part. And then it might be, okay, we're going to show up for class. And it can be that you show up for class. So our experience here, I will just be forthright. So I have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. And my 12-year-old was, she's doing her thing, right? My 9-year-old's not a big fan of that remote distance learning. So our first expectations were that he be available for class. And this was, I will confess, we did a horrible job this summer, and possibly, I'm hoping I'm not the only one here, where my guy got way too much Minecraft time in. So we really had to take some ownership that we had failed him in that part by just allowing him to, I guess, enjoy himself all summer, doing way too much Minecraft. But it was not a fun transition into schoolwork. So we thought, well, we have to have this expectation that you're going to show up at the beginning of the day and that you will do some school work. So he didn't need to do all of the school work, but he had to do something related. So if he wasn't going to do the class reading, he would have to do his own type of reading, and books that we had here. And he was happy to do that, or he was more happy to do a Brain Quest book than to do the assignments in Seesaw for whatever reason. And so, but slowly that has changed for him, and we've slowly increased our expectation. So I wouldn't encourage parents to, I don't want you to change your expectation every few days. Sometimes we find that a kid starts with something. So my kid showed up for school. He refused to have his camera on. But you know what? By the second or third day, he was kind of dipping his toe in. He was kind of in it a little bit more. Now that specific issue is not an issue for him anymore. So I hope that that kind of answers it. But I think you need to start by doing an inventory of kind of where your kid is, thinking about where do you want them to be realistically. So is this about persistence, right? Are you trying to increase attention? Are you trying to work on a specific skill? Are you trying to just get through the day? All of these things are really valid. And so doing that self-inventory. Does that answer that question, Janet?
Yeah, there is a question about, in terms of repetition, how much repetition do you suggest while setting the expectation?
I suggest, so, that's a great question. Yeah, I was thinking of repetition in learning, but you could have your expectation for repetition. I would just write it down. Like I would I think it's okay for people to be reminded of the things that they need to do on a daily basis. And so if that means having a visual schedule or having a visual that says, like I'm in my workspace, I've got my work things, I'm going to have a calm body, or I'm going to use a friendly word in class today, or I'm going to do my math, to just write it down. We know that people do better when their brains are primed to think of something. So for example, it would not be uncommon for someone who has asthma to have pictures kind of around, or a little saying, not pictures, but that just say breathe, right? Just take a deep breath. It's just a good reminder. It's just a good prime. And so for something like that, I guess the answer is as much as you need. So if what it takes is that reminder, that repetition, I would offer the reminder. Optionally, we can transition the reminder from a human being, like a parent saying it over and over again, to something that is not a parent. So whether it is an app on a computer, or on an iPad, or there's little watches that give us a reminder to do things. But I think the repetition is really as much as is needed, and then you kind of just fade it back and see where you're at.
Thank you. There's another question. Do you have suggestions for how you layer on expectations as a child gets more comfortable in a routine?
Yeah. Well, I definitely like that idea of I think it depends on how long it took to get the routine down. I always like being able to enjoy the success that a kid has with something for a little bit before you up the ante. So it's nice to be able to say, like, hey, yay us, we got through this morning routine, or we got to bed without sad eyes, yay us. And you do it for a few days before then you say, hey, I've noticed this is 3 days in a row, right? You really nailed this. Now I know that you're ready to, we might add this other part. And so again, I think by just kind of setting the expectation, recognizing when kids have met that expectation, and then kind of moving on to that next part. I think for kids who are less verbal, again, I would let them kind of be successful and then add this other thing to it, just slowly. That really feels like kind of hedging the response, but it really is just so specific to each child. So I think as they're successful with something, I would revel in that response. It's nice when everyone can feel like, oh, we did it, and then take a breath and move into the next challenge.
So for a specific example, kind of around setting those expectations, a question came in around a 10-year-old who gets really difficult when there are things that need to be done.
Yeah.
Even when parents are positive and negotiate with him, but once a thing goes and doesn't go his way, he just doesn't cooperate. He gets really frustrated. And it sounds like this is really stressful on the family. Yeah. So do you have any tips or tools?
Was my husband secretly chatting in this box? Yes. So I think when I think of that, then I might think of trying to figure out what is it that was challenging about the situation. So again, kind of investigating, is there any type of pattern, or is it just like, yep, something didn't go the way that they was expected, right? They didn't get their way in some way. So I'm looking at things like, is this a time issue? Like, hey, the pattern is every day by 10 o'clock, we are totally fried. Or is the idea that, this always happens with math class, or this always happens when there's a writing assignment, to try to dive deeper and figure out what was the issue there? Is the issue that the child thinks that it's just a dumb assignment, right? They don't want to do it. So some of that might figure, like, is there something on the adult side to do to reconfigure it? And it may be that some things have to move to a different part of the day. It is a challenge when we've got a crabby kid that is not as, excited as we are about them maybe learning remotely on their own. So I really feel those other parents out there. I literally feel your pain. I know a bit about what that is that is like. And so I think on that flip side, I'm thinking about just how important that self-care piece is, depending on an age of a child and your ability to get them at a time of calm, not in a moment of distress, to say, what will work better on this day? So sometimes kids have great suggestions. Sometimes the suggestion will not be reasonable at all. So the suggestion might be like, well, I think I should just do Minecraft all day and never have to do schoolwork. Well, that's not going to happen. But they might say, well, I think I need a longer break. Or we might find out like, oh, we never have the snacks I want when it's snack time. Or, I never get to go outside and do things. Or I want a play date with my friends. Like, oh, okay. So depending on the age of the child and their language skills, they might be able to sort of participate in being a problem solver with you, instead of feeling like the parents are doing all the work and that they are just have to be the recipient of the expectations. So that can be a slippery slope, but that might be something to try. And it can also be that sometimes these slopes are really tricky, and having some professional counseling support can be really helpful too.
Do you, would these techniques also work on an older child or a young adult, or even kind of an older adult? So if a person is kind of set in their ways, or perhaps has some ingrained or old habits, do you have any suggestions for older kids, teens, young adults?
Well, I don't know if there's kind of a specific like a specific task or challenge. I think that we know that, if we're talking about kind of learning a new thing, definitely having visual supports for that can be really helpful, and having lots of repetition. If you have ever decided to move the silverware in your kitchen from one drawer to another drawer, you probably catch yourself a lot of the time going to the old place over and over and over again. Even though if someone asks you, where did you move the silverware? You can tell them where it is, but we just get in habits of doing things. But having some type of, label or indicator there for the first, few weeks even might remind you like, oh yeah, I'm getting this silverware. I think that in general, people do better with visuals. Right? This is why apps are so successful, why people have Outlook and Google Calendars. And we don't need to remember all these things up here. We can have devices that help us to do it, or we can have paper and pen that help us to do it. And so I'm not sure if there was a specific thing to do, but I think that people generally would benefit from all the types of strategies that we're talking about. Just being mindful of, is this an expectation issue? Is there a sensory regulation issue, mindfulness? And we're going to get more into that idea of distress and managing distress in this next part.
Sometimes when these big behaviors are occurring, that can be really upsetting or scary to other siblings, or in the home, or with other kids in the class. Do you have recommendations for how to address these situations when siblings or classmates are around? What do you say? How do you make the youth, how do you not make that youth feel bad for having these big behaviors, or for feeling like they're not up with their siblings or peers?
I guess what I'm hearing from or thinking about in that situation is you have, a student or child who's having some difficulty, and then you have, either the rest of the class, or you have a sibling. And I think how important it is to manage both of those things. So when we have a child who's really upset, the first thing that we need to do is try to figure out how to get that child to a status of calm. So we're not problem solving in that moment. We're just trying to decrease the distress. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I would also say how important it is to check in with the sibling, and to sort of be, or the sibling or the class, and just sort of not acknowledge like, wow, that was really big, or that was really scary. I'm noticing that, and letting kids sort of see like, how are they going to process that? Are there Are there safety issues with a sibling in there? So do we need to talk about that for them? What's a good place for them to, to be if you have a child that is maybe out of control? Are there, what are some things that are helpful? What is not helpful? So siblings have their whole own layer of issues. They may or may not have a similar disability. And there's lots of work done, especially through the University of Washington, regarding siblings and their responses to things. I would encourage you to look at things like sib shops and the work through Don Meyer. So I think of how important it is to check in on both parts and to make a plan. We can't always control everyone's behavior and what happens, but we can certainly talk about how are we safe and what do we do with those feelings. And then there's got to be that sort of gut check with parents and teachers to know what kind of plan do we need to have about this. And so is this something that necessitates more than we're able to give it right now? Does it necessitate meeting with a therapist? Does it necessitate medication, and working on those next steps? So Janet, I'm wondering if, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, are you, there was a second part to the question about kind of the recovery with the child with behavior or who experiences the developmental disability, but it sounds like in the next part, we're going to really talk about anxiety and some of those tools.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about that. And if it's not answered, let's round back to it. Let's make sure it gets answered. Okay.
Great. And for those of you who are joining us, please feel free to continue to add questions to the chat box, and we'll talk about them in our next discussion period.
Great. And so we've just, in that first part, we were talking about this idea about why might children with a developmental disability have increased distress around things and might have challenging behaviors, and ways that we might think about accommodating or addressing issues at home. Let's talk a little bit about managing anxiety or distress. And certainly right now, we are all facing a lot of different anxiety, and there's lots of changes. And so I saw this funny little cartoon, and I thought, yeah, that sounds about maybe how it's going sometimes, that we're all just sort of hanging in there, and it's going better for some than for others. We're talking a little bit about managing anxiety. We know that a great antidote for anxiety can often involve creating a plan. And I like to think of this because I just like alliteration: plan, place, person, props, and a practice or skill. So when I think of a plan, I'm thinking of, what am I going to do? A place, where would I go? So is there a comfy space for me to be? Do I need a sensory tent or create a fort to hide out in? Is my bedroom a good place to calm down if I need it? Who is my person? Who do I talk to? So do I talk to someone on the phone? Do I talk to a friend? Do I talk to someone else in the house? Do I talk to my mom? What are the props? So I think of those as like sensory skills. And how do I make this a practice? How do I build a skill? And so I'm thinking of that in a preventative manner. So some of these things for managing anxiety, we think about making a plan, using things like a visual schedule, including things like, when do I get to do something fun? But we also want to think about, when we're doing something preventative and we're doing something to manage anxiety, when would we do it, right? So do we have a daily time for mindfulness, or for just reading a book or relaxing? You might have a home where just everybody takes a break at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon for 20 or 30 minutes, and it's no screens. Everyone's just relaxing, and so kind of resetting. We might make a plan that says, like, we're going to take a break after we do 10 minutes of work or 3 worksheet problems. And the plan might involve things like, or if I get upset, my plan is to go check in with mom. Maybe my plan when I get upset is to eat something, or go to a calm spot, or create that toolkit so I can use one of the things from there. My plan might be written it out, and I might use a mantra for myself. I might write something like, it's okay to feel worried sometimes. I'll try my best. I might write a reminder like, I can do hard things, or remember, I can take a break. We know that one of the cornerstones for anxiety is learning how to compartmentalize that. So we want to limit the time that's spent worrying for kids who have that. So if we have kids that are worried about school, maybe they have an assignment due, or a child that's worrying about the weather or about a pet or what have you, we want to be able to help them to limit the time that they spend actively worrying. And so we might decide to make a check-in with them. So yeah, okay, there's like, you've got a lot of worries, and a good time for us to talk about these worries is going to be like, you know, maybe it's right at snack time in the afternoon. I would not recommend necessarily having your check-in time right at bedtime, because I think that can go south pretty quickly. But I would have a check-in time to do it. Put the check-in on your schedule, right? And save worries for later in either a journal or a worry box. Some kids will find that their worry is not as much of anxiety, like what's going to happen with this. It's just more of a perseverative thought that they have. When that's the case, sometimes having to write it down takes the fun out of it, talking about it. So it's not going to come up in the same way. But for other kids, that opportunity to write or journal about it might help them to organize their thoughts about it a little bit. And again, delimiting the time is going to be important. We want to make sure that people develop good practices for stress management. So we want to use things like exercise, mindfulness. There's lots of great apps that we've seen, especially come out during this COVID time, to practice mindfulness and meditation. You could do things like yoga. I put this picture here, these little things called yoga pretzels, I think are pretty fantastic. What I like about them is that you have all these little cards that are in the box. And so you might decide to have a plan and you pull out 3 cards, right? If you're feeling a little bit of, distressed, or you're feeling anxious, you could pull out a few cards and do the cards together, and a kid can see all the things that are on there. And so that might be a good fit. So I wanted to put that little plug in. Different calming strategies we think of, again, are like these sensory tools and strategies. Sometimes we have to write them down. People do not use their upstairs brain. They're not using their executive function to help them problem solve when they're dysregulated. And we are all like that. And that is exactly why we all have those moments where we're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or oh, maybe that was too much, or why didn't I do that? Or we get that cup of tea and we think, oh, I really do like this, right? So we forget the things that are helpful to us when we're upset, which is a great reason why we should have a little reminder card for ourselves, like, yeah, here's 5 things I can do to help me calm down and feel better if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I'm feeling anxious, right? And so they might be a sensory tool or strategy. We know that there's things like breathing. A lot of times we tell kids to take deep breaths, but I think that is not a good fit for lots of our kiddos. You could try other breathing strategies that may be effective, like blowing bubbles, blowing feathers across, or little cotton balls across a table. You could do deep breathing using shapes. Maybe there's some visuals that you make, something like a calm mind jar. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. We're just making sure that a child has a good calm down spot, right? So we really want to use our knowledge of a child and disability to inform the way that we accommodate them and then we support them, and that we think about the types of sensory tools that would be effective for them, right? So here's an example of some different types of breathing and relaxation strategies for kids. This idea of like, how can you take good stretches? How do you take deep breaths, right? Some of you with elementary school kids may be familiar with these. We see schools back in the olden times, 6 months ago, we might have, the a turtle makes a choice, Kelso's choices for what to do when they have a problem or upset. So we know that visuals work for kids. Another good relaxation or mindfulness. Some kids find this pretty helpful. This is like a little mindful jar. This is, you can Google this type of thing or Pinterest it. It is water and glitter and glue. And all that glitter kind of falls to the bottom and can be relaxing, maybe relaxing for kids to watch. So different strategies for different kids. So this might work for one kiddo and the next kid might be, you know, just as likely to take it and toss it. So you have to know your audience for sure. To manage anxiety, we want to help kids to remember this, you know, these S's. So again, Tina Payne Bryson, I'm such a big fan of her work, and she just sort of writes about these ideas of the 3 S's for children. Raising children generally are helping them to feel safe, seen, and soothed. So when we say safe, that is pretty straightforward, right? And sometimes with anxiety, it's reminding kids like, yes, you know, kids might be, some of our kiddos are anxious about getting sick during these days. Yes, you know, this is a worry. And here's the things that we're doing to be safe. Like, I know that we are wearing our mask, or I know that you know how to wash your hands. Great. You're doing a great job with that. We want to see them. And when we see them, we think about noticing and acknowledging their feeling, right? You're feeling really overwhelmed, buddy, right? This is really hard stuff. Or you're feeling really upset right now. And the soothing, right? Sometimes it's hard to remember the soothing part. So if a child isn't crying and sometimes they're acting out, our brain may not always recognize that as a moment to soothe, to calm. We know that the gatekeeper to anxiety is often anger and distress. And so thinking about what is the soothing? So if we have these 3 S's, helping children to feel safe, seen, and soothed, I would offer for kiddos who have a developmental disability that we also have to figure out how to scaffold them. So that means providing the just right amount of support, whether it's visuals, it's reminders, it's doing things side by side, it's reduced workload to help them be as successful as possible. So the number 1 rule for managing distress, do not let their distress become your distress. And I will tell you, this is way easier said than done, but trying to remember that when someone is in distress, matching their level of emotion and matching their distress is not going to be helpful. So try not to let your child's distress become your distress. Remember, take a pause and remember your plan, all right? And so, and your plan is calming down, not problem solving. So if the child is out of control and having a hard time, we are not working on teaching them how to load the dishwasher correctly. Or we're not working on how to finish brushing our teeth for bedtime. We are only working on calming them down. So once the child is calm, then you have some more room to move, but piling on more expectations is not going to be helpful. We want to talk less. So we're upset. We can't will someone to calm down. So saying calm down is not helpful. And giving them lots of information. I told you should have done this. This is the, the nth time this has happened, or blah, blah, blah. The more input can actually increase distress in the moment. We want to use visual supports. So the visual support can be you. You can model having a calm voice. You can model deep breaths. You can be in front of your child. They're having, just taking those deep breaths with them. You might go ahead and use something like a feelings board if your child has used one of those before to help choose. Some children in occupational therapy have done things that talk about like the zones of regulation to help a child choose where they're at. You could use a visual choice board for calming. So if you've created something with your kid about what would be helpful, we might be able to show them something. So you might be able to talk to your child to say, I'm wondering if you feel like you want a banana or a hug, right? Do you want to take a break or listen to some music, right? So you can offer some choices depending on your child. Your child may be able to take in that information, or you really might just have to show it, either with something that's drawn out like a visual choice board, or holding them in your hands and seeing if they take one of those. So to do any of these things, so we want to use these strategies with kids. We want to say things like, what would be helpful for you right now? Do you think you need to eat something, or do you think that you need to go do some bubbles or jumping jacks? We got to schedule it. We got to figure out, when are we doing all this yoga, right? We're not going to pull out yoga pretzels for the first time when a kid's really upset. That's not going to work. So we really need to make a plan. So when do we develop a daily plan for people, for a family, to say, our family, our expectations, everybody takes some time each day to take care of their body, right? And that's a plan that seems like everybody's family can do. So maybe taking care of your body is going for a run. Maybe taking care of your body is eating something nourishing. Maybe it is listening to some music. Maybe it's doing yoga. But I think the idea of trying to make it a household thing, like, yep, this is just an expectation. Like, we all have to take care of ourselves. Schedule it, make a plan to do it, have a variety of strategies. So thinking about things, again, like it's not always breathing. You can be listening. You could listen to a book. You could listen to music. You might have a creative outlet. You might have a spiritual practice. You might have a social opportunity. So we want to think about having a variety of strategies that we can use on a daily basis to keep our anxiety and our stress level down, as well as having a variety of strategies that we might be able to use in the moment when a kid is upset. We don't want to, again, introduce something in the heat of the moment. I think it's important to just really note here that often individuals with disability can be really short on the first three basic tenets of self-care and wellness, and that is sleep, exercise, and healthy eating. And so to the degree that we can work on these things first, if your child is someone who is not getting good sleep, they're not getting enough exercise, and or they're not having some healthy eating, some of these kind of core base things can be a great place to start thinking about improving. When we improve that general wellness, we certainly improve overall capacity to handle distress when it comes up. So Janet, now I'm wondering a little bit more about how that particular parent was feeling, if that question got answered or not so much.
I will wait until they comment in the Q&A section.
Sure.
In the meantime, there was a couple other questions that popped up. So what are some sensory tools and strategies for calming different ages and adults?
Yeah. So different calming strategies other than breathing strategies, some of those are, there's environmental things we might do. We might think to lower or dim the lights, not totally turn them off. That can trigger, but dimming lights. So we're thinking about decreasing sensory input. We're going to stop talking. If there's music on, we might turn the music down or off, right? For some people, they may be someone who touch is something that is helpful to him. So maybe having a hug or weighted blanket, that is helpful. And we also know that there's plenty of kiddos where touching is, exciting, and that's not going to be helpful in the moment. It's going to work at a cross purpose to what we're doing. So we think of those things. It could be a fidget. I think it depends on how distressed or out of control someone might be in the moment. So if I'm thinking of someone who's maybe a little bit amped up and I need to calm them down, there's physical things. If you can get a kid to do a dance party or some movement, that can be a good idea. Definitely, I'm always a fan if I can get a kid to look at a picture, a book, a maze, or a puzzle. because I'm finding that they're working different skills that might be able to shift them a little bit if they're up for it.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, you had mentioned a fidget. There was a question about, just out of curiosity, why you don't like fidget spinners, because this particular person doesn't either.
Yeah. I don't like fidgets. Well, I mean, I've been known to spin with the best of them, but I think that for me, a fidget spinner is really, it's just a toy, and there's nothing wrong with toys. I like toys. I think the problem is it doesn't meet the purpose that I'm intending it for. So if my intention is to help me relax and keep focused, a fidget spinner, in my opinion, experience, doesn't work to that purpose. If my intention is just to have a toy and a great time, then it's amazing. So that's why I don't like it. I think there are better things that work for the purpose that I intend them to, and I would do those things instead.
Thank you. There was another question that came in about what words could be used to help a child cope with the busy children in his class. Specifically, this child is in 6th grade, and there are quite a few busybodies in his class. He is hyper-focused when he is on an assignment, so he gets very frustrated with his classmates when they are distracting. And this parent would like to help him become more flexible with his peers, but he reports that he doesn't like them much because they are distracting. Is this a flexibility issue?
Wow, gee, I really hear that 6th grader. That that can definitely happen, right? So I don't know if they're in a classroom or if they're doing distance learning. Certainly, I think that it's a great opportunity in 6th grade, and if this is a particularly vocal child who has good language skills, helping to voice what they need from their with their teacher. I think self-advocacy is an important skill for kids to learn. And so if this is someone who is able to do that, I think one, figuring out what is it they want to have happen. So we would like kids to not be so busy and distracting, but that might not be something that, that's not possible. We can't kick kids out of class because they're annoying. But there might be some things that could be done. So if it's in a virtual class, is it possible that, is there a way to not see certain people in class? So can he just pin the teacher and pay attention to the teacher and not have to pay attention to the other 18 kids in class? If he's in a classroom, could he have different seating? Are there things that might help him to focus a little bit better? So is it, again, like it's so different between being in class and being on Zoom or something. If you're in a classroom, we think of things like, do headphones help? Is it possible to focus on the work? If it's not possible to be in that class, like it's so disruptive, that definitely sounds like a case of saying to the teacher, like, hey, I like this class and this is too distracting for me to work. I don't know that that's totally a flexibility issue. Flexibility issue would be like, these kids are distracting and they're mean and I hate them and I can never be friends with them. Like that's maybe being a little bit inflexible, but saying that someone's being too distracting for people to learn, I think that's a self-advocacy issue, actually.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions regarding kind of screen time. Yeah. So one is how to manage what they're doing on the screen without being the screen police, which sets up a difficult relationship. So the example this parent gave is a child says they're doing an assignment, but really they're on YouTube or playing a video game. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's one, don't ask a question that you know the answer to. So if you come into a room and you know that your guy was on YouTube or your gal was on, YouTube, don't say, were you just on YouTube? Like you already know the answer to it, then you should go ahead and just call it out. I would focus on what it is that you want to have happen. I think if what the child is supposed to be doing is, getting some classwork done, and they get it done, and they have the wherewithal to get all their work done and find this YouTube time, I would say, yay you. If the issue is instead of being in class, I am on YouTube, then that's a different issue. And so some of that would be checking in with the teacher to say, is the student participating in class or not? It is so difficult right now. Like, we need kids to be on screens in order to be participants in the world in general, not just school, but everything. That's how they're connecting with their friends by and large. And so just decide if that is that where you need to throw your weight into the ring. So if it's a content issue, that's something different to set up. But as far as the time, I would figure out what's happening when they're doing this, instead what's not getting done, and focus on the thing that you do want to get done. I wonder if, does that answer that question?
Yes. And if not, please, put clarifying questions in the chat box. We just have a few more minutes. There's another question regarding screen time. So this is from a parent of a 7-year-old who some of her work is doing Dreambox, which is a math app thing. Mm-hmm. There are lots of reward games that she gets to do, and she spends a long time playing and not so much time working. Okay. Then they need to finish up some work in the evening, and that's when she tends to be pretty stretched thin and doesn't have the resources to go through the schoolwork. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yes, that then one, what a nice problem to have when a learning application is actually a reward, right? So Dreambox is set up. I know exactly the app that you're talking about. They use that at my kiddo's school as well. So it might mean that I suspect that then your child is thankfully then doing more than what they need to do on the Dreambox to get the rewards, and super fun, instead of doing some other things. And so what I might suggest doing is setting a timer or a limit for the amount of time that they have, then going back to whatever's the other part that's missing. Is it reading? Is it science? Or is it an art project? And then having more Dreambox time later on, not in the evening necessarily, but later on in the day, so that you're not doing it in the evening. I think optimally we're done with school by 3. That would be a good goal, I think, for people. I think we're all operating under the assumption that at some point in the universe, we will be back to doing what we thought was happening pre-COVID, which means that you have a chunk of the day that you are at school, and then you have a chunk of the day that you're at home, and then another chunk that you are sleeping. And so trying to get back to that, I would really encourage, and I would use the Dreambox as a reward. It's just a fun thing to do. I'm so glad that she enjoys it. And I would acknowledge that, like, yay, you're good at math and you like this thing and it's awesome. And it turns out that we're doing so much time on Dreambox, we didn't get our reading done. So we got to make a plan about that. So either we do reading first, or you do Dreambox, take a break, and then you come back to it.
Okay, we have time for one more. Is it recommended to have a talk with a kid and try to explain why? In this case, with a child who experiences ADHD, they get in those moments of frustration. Will this help? If so, how to approach this child?
Right. And I think depending on the age of the child, I think you might moderate the way that you're presenting that information for them. And I think some of it is just noticing, right? And so noticing them, like, wow, this is really frustrating. It seems hard to be, it seems hard to pay attention to this, or you're moving your body around. And I wonder what would help. So being a curious, cohort with them, I think can be a good place to start. And seeing if you can figure out something together that might be helpful. If your child certainly has, whether it's ADHD or something else, if you have those words to talk with them about, say, yeah, there's a reason that that's like that. Like your brain's a little bit different. So this is easier. Some stuff is easier for other kids, just like it's easier for you. And the thing that's really hard for your brain is just like staying focused, right? So we can do some stuff about that. Let's see if any of these things work. There are a number of books that are written for kids who have ADHD or autism and Asperger's disorder, anxiety, a number of things. I know that Swindells has a great resource library. They may have some of those books there that you can think of. For this particular parent, I would put a plug out for Attitude Magazine. It's ADDITUDE, like attitude. It's very clever. They have an online magazine, but their website has lots of resources on there about helping and supporting kids with ADHD. I like that all of the articles are short because they're directed toward parents of kids with ADHD and also people with ADHD. And so that would be another good resource to put up. But I definitely would advocate sort of talking to kids at their level about what you know about them and being curious with them about some things that might help. And, be scientists or investigators. Let's see if this works. And if it works, yay, yes. And if it doesn't, it's nobody's fault. We're just going to move on to something different.
Great. Actually, a really great question just came in, and then this will be our final question this evening. Many kids, especially kids on the spectrum, have regressed socially during the shutdown and are really resistant to doing anything social, especially as simple as a family walk. What steps can parents prepare / move towards going back into a 3D school setting?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's really a conundrum of how to get this done. The first thing might be encouraging trying to get some of that social time, continuing to have a social expectation for kids, whether that means that I spend part of my day. I can choose to walk with my family on the family walk. We're going to play a game together. I'm going to do I'm doing a Zoom call with a friend, and we're going to do Minecraft. So finding something social, so keeping an expectation for social time, for social skills, with some options. Sometimes it takes the wind out of the sails a little bit if there's a number of things to choose from. I would definitely encourage parents to, particularly for kids of autism, to keep that expectation there, because I think that it's really hard to gain control, and that might be a function of anxiety. Not doing something is really reinforcing, and so we want to. I wouldn't stop doing it. I would keep having that expectation about it, and I think maybe we can I can do a little bit more research about that sort of specifically. We can see if we have some time to think about that next week. And I can also see what Autism Society of Oregon may have some upcoming things about that too.
Wonderful. Marie, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us this evening. As Marie mentioned, part 2 of supporting your complex child will be next Wednesday, the 30th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. If you have not registered for that event, I will be sending the registration link out in an email tonight, along with a link for a post-event survey. Please take the time to fill out the survey. We use this information to help shape our events moving forward based off of the feedback that you give us about the information you want to hear. There will also be a link once you complete the survey. If you need a certificate of attendance, one will be emailed to you. Again, I want to thank our community partners and the Providence Child's Health Foundation for their generous support that allows us to bring events like this free to the community. If you have additional questions or resource needs, please feel free to reach out to the Swindells Resource Center at 503-215-2429 or swindells@providence.org. And I put that email in the chat box. Again, Marie, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Okay.